As a fisherman, I make my living on the coast. So when my son told me about protecting the coast, I thought he was going to tell me to stop fishing. But I finally went to one of them meetings with he and it opened my eyes. Terms like climate change, storm surge, and beach erosion had me so confused. But Junior showed me that when we got a storm, we lose a bit more of the beach, and how developers, locals, tourists, and the fishing community all have to learn to use the coast without damaging the coast. If we don't do more to protect our coast, we could lose everything.
Like Freddie and Junior, there are many who rely on our coast for their livelihood. The Coastal Zone Management Unit is working to sustainably manage our coastal spaces by mitigating the impacts of climate change for generations to come through updating the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Plan. From monitoring beach levels, restoring mangroves and wetlands, to working with community leaders and private developers, the CZMU is planning for a safer and more resilient coast. See more of Freddie and Junior's story on the CZMU and GIS social media. Play your part to manage and protect our coast, our home, our future. To view the updated ICZM plan and learn more, visit coastal.gov.bb/ICZM plan.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th in a series of 8 public meetings, which make up the public inquiry for the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Plan and our draft Coastal Zone Management Area. My name is Alison Wiggins, and I will be taking you through the proceedings for this evening. We have a team that is well-versed, a very skilled team, and I will take this opportunity to welcome you and the team as well, and I will introduce the team tonight. From the Coastal Zone Management Unit, we have Dr. Leo Brewster, who's the director. Our deputy director is Mr. Antonio Rowe. Our project manager is Mr. Ricardo Arthur. Our coastal planner is Fabian Hines. The Coastal Information Systems Manager is Ramon Roach. Our marine biologist is Richard Suku. And we have as our coastal engineer, Mr. Shamari Cave. Proceeding over, the person who will be in charge of tonight's proceeding is our chairperson. Her name is Dr. Yolanda Aline. And we're supported by a team from IH Cantabria in Spain, which is headed by Mr. Raul Medina Santa Maria. And the team leader is Mr. Jonathan McHugh, who's ably supported by Maria Marino, Heather Barker, and Renee Gibson. This evening, I would like to remind you that this is the area, the sub-area, from Maycock's Bay to Batt's Rock. And this area we know is our main tourism stretch. We have not only tourism-related activity, but we also have commercial activity, and there's a lot of residential activity within the area as well. We have several coastal resources in that area. We have our beaches, which are world-renowned, our coral reef, and our coastal vegetation. And the infrastructure, perhaps the primary one in this sub-area, is the road, Highway 1, in this sub-area. So at this point in time, let me take this opportunity to introduce you to our chairperson, Dr. Yolanda Aline, who will give a few words at the moment.
Thank you very much, Alison, and good evening, everyone. My name is Yolanda Aline. I am the chairperson for the series of public consultations for the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Plan. And I join Alison in welcoming you to this, our 6th public consultation for the plan. As many of you know, the areas either side of our shoreline are zones of intense activity. Alison just described them to you, and this the area that we're discussing this evening. On the landward side, generally, you know that we may know that about 50% of our population, and I think it's estimated that about 95% of our tourism-related infrastructure is concentrated in or near what we traditionally know as our coastal zone. We have in that same area, we have our schools, our health facilities, our power plants, a lot of activity going on there. And on the seaward side, as Alison just pointed out, there are many coastal resources, coral reefs, etc. We engage in leisure cruising, and we have fishing and diving and swimming, and we have cargo ships all in that zone. It is very difficult to manage our coastal areas in an island this size without recognizing the significant impacts of land-based activities from the upper reaches of our watersheds all the way through to our coastline and into our marine areas. And it is also important to note that going forward, integrated coastal zone management is essential to Barbados, as healthy oceans and coastal areas is vital to our economics in the future. So this draft Barbados Integrated Coastal Zone Plan is a timely intervention in the context of increasing climate and disaster risks, and combined with more coastal development and intense use of our marine areas. Now is the time to get involved in this integrated and coordinated management of our coastal areas. We, the general public, and key stakeholders are all custodians of our coasts, and this consultation process is important for everyone to get involved. As your chairperson, I'm going to listen carefully to your inputs, and at the end of all the consultation sessions, I'm going to make recommendations on how the plan may be strengthened for us to use it in a very impactful way. So I hope that many of you have had a chance to read the plan, but in any case, I wish you to listen very carefully to what is proposed in terms of policy tools and guidelines for our coastal areas management, and give meaningful feedback to support or improve or give alternative options to what has been put forward this evening as part of our draft plan to strengthen the management of our coastal areas. I encourage you to take notes, clear your thoughts during the presentation, and share constructively your viewpoints when we get to the discussion session. We look forward to a very productive and meaningful interaction with you this evening. And our focus today, as Alison said, will be on sub-area 6, the area from Maycock's Bay to Batt's Rock. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aline. Now we have the Director of the Coastal Zone Management Unit, Dr. Leo Brewster, who will give us an introduction to this plan. What does this plan mean for us as we go forward into the next 10 years? And what is the sub-area like? Dr. Brewster, your comments.
Leo, you're muted. You're muted.
Right. Good evening to everybody. So as Alison has rightfully pointed out, this is the 6th meeting that we've had, and our chairperson has highlighted a lot of the issues that we're going to face. But what I'm going to do this evening is just provide a little bit of the background in terms of how we got to where we are in the plan. If it would like to work. There we go. So the first plan was done in 1995 out of the Delcan study, which focused on the west and south coast of the island at the time. And it was the compilation of all the work from the technical feasibility studies and pre-investment studies that were done. It documented a lot of information on the west and south coast reefs and the ecosystems therein, looking at the coastal engineering structures, water quality considerations, and established the beach change monitoring program through the creation of new beach monitoring locations, as well as refining the locations we were doing since about 1983. In total now we have close to about 110 beach profile locations around the entire island that are now monitored quarterly. In the second plan, coming out of the East Coast study in 1998, this was a comprehensive presentation of all the work that we did on the east coast of the island, which was the first time we had actually looked at that section of the coastline in any significant manner. And it captured a lot of the similar sort of information that we did for the west and south coast. But it was a compressed study that had a lot of socioeconomic information and a lot of deep water work as well, to try to get us to understand, more importantly, what was going on that side of the island, which we know is a totally contrasting coastline to the west and south coast of the island. During that study, that was the first time that we ever used light imaging and data ranging information, which is LiDAR. And We were the first in the island to introduce that, which is a commendation on our part. As part of the outcomes from the work, we also look to redefine the West and South Coast data and information to be consistent with the East Coast data that had been collected over the time. And the plan itself looked to identify priority areas for integrated coastal zone management. It looked at the division of the coastline into the sub-areas, the 8 sub-areas that we have now categorized the island shoreline as being of importance, principally because each sub-area is uniquely different from each other, and it provided guidance for those sub-areas in terms of the type of integrated coastal management activities that should take place, and the agencies, their responsibilities, and the interrelated nature and how the work should occur. Now, this third plan, the 2021 plan, is a 10-year plan stretching from 2020 to 2030, and is the combined work of IH Cantabria presenting the results that were culminated from the Delcan study, which focused on the Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Program. Sorry, the Baird study, which focused on the Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Program. And that looked at how we could integrate climate change and disaster risk management into the coastal zone management process. So why do we need the plan? Why is the plan being updated? We recognize that there's several observed impacts that we will always experience on the coastline, and they're becoming more exacerbated because of climate change. Modern coastal management delivery models are now required for Barbadians to realize the significance of the goods and services and development opportunities that the coast provides. Consideration is also having to be given to new approaches to protect the natural assets to the benefit of coastal communities in order to achieve economic prosperity into the future. Government is committed to adapting and adopting a new strategy in order to better implement climate change and disaster risk resiliency into the climate change process, which focuses on new adaptation strategies to provide optimum response to climate change. The new delivery model has to introduce improved coastal risk understanding and deal with infrastructural and non-infrastructural adaptative measures that are designed to increase resiliency. But it must be remembered that in order to implement a risk-resilient ICZM, it is not a simple task. Now, the key differences between the plan are outlined on this slide, but what becomes apparent is the notice that in the 1998 study, there were 3 volumes to the plan. There was the policy framework, the Caribbean Coast Plan, and the Atlantic Coast Plan. The significant and advances in ICZM were also categorized in the 1998 plan. We had development guidance for the management of coastal uses and the development of regulations along the coastline, and we focused on integrating the role and function of all agencies involved in coastal management. For the more recent study now, we have a situation where this plan, the 2020 plan, adopts the disaster risk management and climate change adaptation approach towards supporting effective coastal planning and its incorporation of the results from the Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Project into the process. It also looks at what we call the National Coastal Risk Information Planning Platform information and shows how that can be integrated into this process as well. It is also focused on improving the capacity of coastal zone to integrate climate change considerations into the coastal zone management process, and it identifies new reporting structures for monitoring and evaluation, which was something that was not present in the previous plan. The intended impact of the plan is really just to provide the detailed guidance for the management of the coastal resources, their uses, and their regulation. The principles of island systems management, which has always been our guide, still retains its central focus for the functioning of how we look at the plan itself. The focus in relation to protection of coastal resources and the reduction of climate change and disaster risk-related risk falls with ever increasingly towards the Coastal Zone Management Unit as part of its remit, And therefore, especially in the evaluation of coastal applications, we have to be more cognizant of these sort of issues. This doesn't mean that we weren't looking at climate change considerations before, because way back in the 1990s, during the Delcan study, we were integrating climate change considerations into the design of our coastal structures along the way. And that was then enhanced when we started to do the coastal infrastructure program, where we built the Richard Haynes Boardwalk and the West Coast Accessway in Old Town, where we provided even more consideration into how climate change had changed in the time period between the 90s up to the mid-2000s in terms of how we were going to be looking to move forward. The identification of boundaries for the coastal zone management area and a specific zone of influence, both externally and internally, has also been defined, as is a requirement of the legislation, and the CZMU shall continue to be involved in supporting and contributing the existing collaborative partnerships and forums that are being established now and that have been ongoing from the time we've been around, with the specific focus of looking at the blue economy rollout in terms of our own sector portfolio being refined. The cost of doing nothing is pretty clear cut. If we don't really and truly look at the detailed integration of climate change considerations into integrated coastal management, a lot of these resources that we have on the coastline will be lost. There's no question about it. We have to be innovative in terms of how we plan to examine and implement coastal development, coastal restoration, different activities in terms of what is taking place, especially during winter swell seasons and more importantly, during the hurricane season. We have to look at mitigation measures that have to be developed and agreed on at the policy level. These new concepts are being captured in the new policy framework document that we have. And it must be remembered that through the ICZM plan, there is a close interrelationship with the PDP, the Physical Development Plan. And it is intended that the coastal plan, being a subsection of the PDP, provides strength to the PDP in terms of the type of activities that can take place along the coastal fringe. What must be remembered is that we have to plan to prevent rather than plan to spend money after disaster hits. The key policy outcomes then and now are presented here, but I think we should focus on what's really and truly the policy outcomes for 2020. And those are really and truly looking at sustainable socioeconomic development is achieved through sustainable development of the coastline, which is our basic mandate. We're looking at the coastal resources being protected and effectively managed. We're looking at climate and disaster risk adaptive capacity being strengthened. We're also looking at the integrated coastal zone management process being delivered through a coordinated governance arrangement. The capacity for integrated coastal zone management delivery also being strengthened for all the relevant sectors. And finally, that research and understanding and knowledge and outreach is increased, which is all part of what we do as part of our overall work initiatives. And we must still also ensure that even in doing that sort of research, that financial resources are going to be made available through the capacity delivery to strengthen the sectors. The plan itself, in terms of its structure, has 5 principal areas. The first component of the plan, or the first section of the plan, sets the scene for risk resiliency. The second part looks at the adaptive pathway that must be created in terms of how we look to roll out the initiatives that are going to follow. The third part looks at the national guidance strategies that need to be implemented to show the linkages between different activities that take place and those that are now being considered to be prioritized significance for the coastal zone management unit. Then we get into the sub-area descriptions and the associated action briefs. And then finally, it looks at how the implementation of the plan can be successfully achieved, what needs to be done to monitor implementation and the reporting associated with it. Jonathan is going to get into this much in greater detail after this presentation. So in summary, we got to recognize that the government is ramping up the efforts to address the country's coastal vulnerabilities that it faces as a threat from climate change. We're looking to ensure that the draft plan presents the methods to redefine the boundaries of the coastal zone management area. And once defined, that will assist the plan in being implemented. The new policy and plan aims to introduce and improve coastal risk understanding and the methods into the delivery and design of improved coastal adaptive planning. The new integrated approach also looks at having at its core the focus to reduce the exposure to coastlines and coastline infrastructure, to hazards of various forms, many of which were covered as part of the CRAMP, the Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Program. The island-wide systems management approach remains central to all that we do, and that the plan itself uses the latest knowledge and science on climate change and coastal risk to produce guidelines, legislations, and regulations to assist us to better achieve our long-term goals. I want to thank you, and I'm going to hand it back to Alison now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brewster, for a very informative presentation. Now, I hope you have your questions. I hope you have your questions ready at the time you have the question and answer session. So you can start preparing your questions all right now. When we do the question and answer session, you will be able to use the feature, the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen and type your question. You can also add in your name and your organization. But if we have an intervention, an urgent intervention, we would ask you to raise your hand and we will get the mic open for you. So start formulating your questions at this point in time. Now we have the presentations by Jonathan McHugh and Ricardo Arthur. Jonathan McHugh is going to tell us about the characteristics of this sub-area from Maycock's Bay to Batt's Rock, and he will tell us the policy interventions that we're proposing for this area. And then Ricardo will pull it all together by giving the economic considerations that this plan will bring. So I'm going to toss it over to Jonathan to start his presentation with you. Jonathan?
Thank you, Alison, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. We're going to, before we start into my presentations, just going to open up with some poll questions. We're going to get you involved with some interactive questions, and I'm just going to share my screen to start that process. Some of you have been present with us for some other sub areas, I've noticed, and we will be capturing a lot of the information on all of these poll questions for all of the sub areas. So we're here to learn about you and understand how au fait you are with the details of the both plans that Dr. Brewster has been discussing. And our first question, which is going to be coming up on the screen, is quite a simple one, just to determine whether you are aware of the 1998 plan, which was originally prepared by Halcro. Could you just give your answer very simply as to yes, you're aware of it, no, you're not, or whether you're uncertain? And that's the original plan prepared in 1998. What the team will be doing is compiling these results, and graphically we will all see the results of the various quick questions. So this evening we have 83% that are certainly aware and 70% that are unaware of that plan. So our next question builds on that point, and it's specifically with regard to the updated 2020 plan and the reason for this evening's discussion. So if you could give a score, give your vote on one of the following three choices with regard to the 2020 updated plan. Firstly, I didn't know about it. Secondly, I know of it, but I've not had time to review it. And thirdly, you've been extremely diligent and you've had time to review it, and you've got to have some targeted questions today. So if you could just give a score to one of those three. We'll collate those and give an assessment. Like I said, I know some of you have been on other sub-area meetings. And we've got a bit of a 50-50 split here, with a good 47% have been very diligent and have reviewed it in some detail, and the other 47% being almost as diligent, saying they're aware of it but haven't had time to review it. Our third question is learning about yourselves and what your key interests are on the Barbadian coast. It's not necessarily to do with sub-area 6, but give us your view on one of the following three. Whether you use the coast for your own personal recreation, whether you live on the coast, or whether your business relies on healthy coastal resources around the coast. This gives us a bit of a cross-section over the 8 sub-areas to determine the type of stakeholder which are present on the evening meetings. And tonight's audience is looking like the majority, 63%, are using this coast for personal recreation, and roughly 20% each living on the coast or their business is reliant on healthy coastal resources. And our final question before I move on to my presentations are all about you as a stakeholder. And we'd like to learn whether you are a member of the general public, whether you are working for the private sector, whether you work for a public institution, or whether you are from an NGO related organisation. So one of those four, and we'll compile those results. And this evening's attendees, a healthy mix. So we have a healthy mix of general public, 37%, 16% from the private sector, and 26 public institutions, and 21% non-government associations. So that gives us a good perspective as to who's present this evening, and so it helps me to sort of couch the following half an hour, which I'll be talking to you about various topics. So this presentation that I'm going to give you is designed to make sure that we're all on the same page with regard to the global and regional significance of climate change and how this may manifest itself in terms of more localized disaster events that may present themselves on this or other sub-areas of Barbados. And with reference to this climate story, you as Caribbean people are at the forefront of this planetary threat, and your communities and businesses remain acutely vulnerable to the dangers of being aware of rising seas and other impacts that are accelerating with climate change. But what this means for the coast could be a range of hazards, as you can see on the sides of this slide. And this includes rising seas, more intense storms, coastal runoff from land, increasing beach erosion, increasing seawater temperature, which is resulting in coral bleaching, plus issues of more regional issues such as ocean acidification, and all of which are contributing towards reducing the natural protection offered by coastal resources. And so the Coastal Zone Management Unit over the last 20 years have been studying the effects of climate change on the coast. And their work as part of the Coastal Risk Management Programme, in summaries, concludes that a series of key climate-related hazards must be managed in an integrated manner if coastal resource management is to be effective and successful. And in addition to hazards such as tsunami inundation, oil spills and terrestrial flooding, these all must be embraced in tandem with the more common appreciation of hurricanes, tropical storms, landslides, coastal erosion, and storm surge events. So what do these mean? And what do we mean when I talk about coastal resources? Well, these can include cultural resources that are specific to the Barbados coast, such as valued seascapes, though more commonly, they're understood as being what you'd know as coastal habitats or ecosystems. And this includes beaches, coral reefs, wetlands, or coastal cliffs and caves. And so as a result, protecting these coastal resources, therefore, needs to be a national priority. And so I'm going to introduce another poll question for you now, and it's devoted at capturing your view on the importance of coastal resources in this sub-area 6. So on the screen, you will see a series of coastal resources ranging from beaches and dunes, coastal cliffs and caves, wetlands and swamps, coral reefs and seabeds, cultural resources, and finally geological formations. So if you just scroll down, you'll see those 6 coastal resources. Now each of those 6 has a score of 1 to 5, and I'd like you to score each of those coastal resources as how you believe the importance level is. So if you believe that they are of low importance in this sub area, you give it a score of a 1. If you think they're very important, you give it a score of a 5. And that applies to all of the 6 coastal resources. So move down this set of questions, click a button that you think is most appropriate to that particular coastal resource. And as if by magic, the team will compile the results and present them in front of us. And we can see very quickly that, thankfully, you're all believing that beaches are of very high importance. We have a mix with regard to coastal cliffs and caves, and that's obviously relevant to the sub area this evening, where coastal cliffs and caves are at a premium. Wetlands and swamps, likewise. Okay, we have whole town, but we have a 60% score for wetlands. Coral reefs, 93%. Cultural resources, slightly lower and a little bit more mixed. And geological formations, as the situation is in this study area, has got a mix of a third between scores 3, 4, and 5. So thank you for that. And what's the reason for doing that is that these poll results, just from what you've done, have emphatically concluded that 2 of these resources types are of very high importance, namely beaches and coral reefs. And this slide shows how the beach level sort of changed within a certain part of this sub area really dramatically over different timescales. In fact, I can remember talking to locals who have clearly stated that even only a few decades ago, when they were small children, they could be able to play a decent game of cricket on the beach at Sandy Lane, for example. And you can see on the slide that the beach levels between the year 2000 and the same wall area in 2015 are significantly different. And over the same time period, sediment volume change is perhaps best seen from the air. And this slide shows the significantly wider sand levels along this Sandy Lane Bay area in the year 2000 compared to 2015. And I even know from firsthand personal experience the volatility of beach levels in this particular area. And at least 4 feet of beach change can be seen just on these images in only 18 months between what was January 2015 and September 2016. So this area is also known as an important source of coral sands as a consequence of the reefal material that's present within the area. However, some critical regional issues are threatening the integrity and health of coral reefs across the country and the region. And in particular, along the patch reefs of Subarea 6, this is quite noticeable. And from a regional Caribbean perspective, there's a noted decline in stag and elkhorn coral as a result of the onset of a number of factors, including the onset of coral diseases. And in addition, there's a reduction in spiny sea urchins. For the scientists among us, they're known as Diadema antillarum. And the impact of that, and a consequence of that is of various sort of regional disease factors. And on top of this, mass coral bleaching events have taken place in the Caribbean over the last few decades. And so more local issues are also contributing to a reduction of coral health. And this includes the overexploitation of reef fish, causing a loss of grazing fish, which means that algae has more opportunity to proliferate on the reefs. And if this happens, then there's an increase in eutrophication, in other words, water quality deterioration issues. And this will reduce the opportunity for reefs to grow as algal levels increase. And finally, increased sedimentation and suspended turbidity levels equally impact on the ability of corals to dispel sediment and their polyps, thus creating increased coral reef stress conditions. So this brief presentation that I'm going to move on to now demonstrates the the adopted approach towards revising the boundaries of the coastal zone management area. And it also provides an overview as to how new and innovative setback classifications are being proposed. And technical details of this are all found within volume 2 of the new ICZM plan. But the first question that needs posing is, well, why do we need a coastal zone management area? And the simple answer to this is that there's a formal mandate on the coastal zone management unit to protect coastal resources as defined within the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1998. And it also helps to define the boundary or the geographic scope of the revised ICZM plan. So this coastal zone management area is the area where all relevant coastal resources apply, in addition to those socioeconomic activities that may have an impact on coastal resource health, their status, or their integrity. And as defined in law, any new development proposal that's identified within this coastal zone management area shall have regard to the provisions and guidelines set out within the ICZM plan. That means that the coastal zone management unit will be acting in an advisory capacity to all statutory authorities on all relevant policies, regulations, and advisories that may apply within the coastal zone management area. But it should be understood that this coastal zone management area is not the same as a developmental setback distance. And this shall be explained a little bit later in my presentation. So the recent poll that you all undertook just now, it demonstrated that there's a range of coastal resources that need to be considered to help determine the spatial extent of this area. And put simply, all the highly technical surveys and analyses that have been carried out by the unit over the past decade or so have all been used to help define this inland and the offshore limits of the coastal zone management area. And this pays due consideration to the geographic footprint of coastal habitats, plus cultural, geological, landscape, seascape, and other coastal infrastructure that takes place there. So in tandem with the latest predictions of coastal hazard inland limit impacts, a set of detailed criteria has also been used to help determine the inland and offshore limits of each coastal resource. For example, you'll see on the screen in pink that for coral reefs, the criteria that's been used relates to the extent of living shallow water coral reef ecosystems, which is roughly estimated at being close to the 150-meter bathymetric contour, whereas the defined coastal landscape protection area, which is denoted within the physical development plan, often commands a 200-meter inland buffer from the coast. And the outcome of this is that the new analysis work is that the coastal zone management area is variable in its extent. It's not consistent around the country. And you'll see from this slide in green that the coastal zone management area in sub-area 6 has very similar inland and offshore limits to those proposed that were originally established in 1998 by HALCRO. And you can see that through the blue diagonal lines on the slide. And if you see the two red arrows, this shows the similar limits to those that were adopted in 1998 by HALCRO, whereby the inland limits were more commonly defined by Highway 1. The seaward limit also remains similar to the offshore limits the extent set in 1998, with slight additional increases in the extent of the sub-area to better cover the fringing reef extent and the surf zone where active sediment transportation takes place, and that is important to influence beach profile shape. What's new to this 2020 ICZM plan is that there's a new what's called a zone of influence. And this is defined, which extends from the seaward limit of the coastal zone management area out to the 12-mile territorial limit. And here the role of the unit will be to raise awareness on marine developments to both the public, the private sector, civil society, and the general public, or where future considerations of an offshore activity is being raised as part of a separate yet parallel blue economy strategy that's underway, as mentioned by Dr. Brewster. This slide shows how the new updated ICZM policy framework embraces a range of current and pending policies that are seeking to promote sustainable management of coastal and marine resources that align with both the physical development plan and this new ICZM plan. And this also covers the roof-to-reef cross-sectional approach that's being adopted around the country. And this may help to provide advice on the development of joint initiatives to promote the conservation and sustainable exploitation of coastal resources within the zone of influence that I showed earlier, which this diagram does show, and it covers the area out to the reef edge and then beyond out to the exclusive economic zone limits over to the left-hand side. So before we move on to discuss the new approach with regard to developmental setbacks, I just want to pose one more simple poll question to you. And I'd like you to answer the following question. Do you agree with the new revised delimitation of the coastal management area compared to that which was defined in 1998? And as I showed in the slide, that there are close similarities. There are more differences in other sub-areas. I'd like you to answer with one of the following options. Yes, I understand the reasoning for the change in totality. Yes, but in parts it appears too wide inland or offshore. Yes, but in parts I feel that the area is too narrow inland or offshore. No, it's better to just remain with the 1998 version, or you have no view either way. So give us your perspective on that, and that's actually very valuable for us to sort of get a national perspective on the reasoning for the change of this coastal zone management area. So the results will come through, and we've got just over half of you saying that they understand the reasoning and it makes sense. And we've got about 24% saying that they understand it, but it's possibly a bit too narrow and it possibly could be extended further offshore or inland. And that's an interesting observation. So we'll come on to those points possibly in the question and answer session a bit later. We'll now briefly outline how the revised plan is to improve climate resiliency into developmental planning through the use of setbacks. And the first question is, why is this needed? Well, setbacks, in fact, are a key tool that are used by coastal planners on a global scale. And they refer to areas where development should be restricted or where specific provisions need to be imposed or applied to ensure the provisions of the safety aspects for structures, persons, and wider communities are taken into consideration. And in Barbados, setback policies are not new, as you probably know, though historically, linear distances selected were often not technically justified due to a poorer understanding of climate-related impacts. What the revised ICZM plan is now able to offer is a suite of refined setback distances and categories that are not only dictated by improved scientific understanding, but it's designed to not stand in the way of development to take place, even within defined limits, so long as it complies with necessary environmental impact assessment regulations and that technical studies are undertaken that are deemed necessary by either town and country planning or as advised by agencies such as the Coastal Zone Management Unit. And this revised ICZM plan, similar to the existing one, can be used for the assessment of applications at this point, even without approval, as planning law explicitly states that a plan in preparation can be used as material consideration. So what do these setbacks look like in reality in sub-area 6? Well, you can see on this slide that they include the following range of possibilities. Firstly, you'll see in orange the minimum 30-metre setback as defined by the physical development plan from high water. But this only applies to beachfront developments. It doesn't apply to land which is fronted by cliffs. Hence, whilst of course many parts of the Barbados coast do not have beachfront development, this 30-metre setback does not apply along the entire coast of the country. However, a new setback distance to those areas is applied subject to the hazards or the resource protection needs. And this extra distance will be determined by separate technical analysis. And this can include the following. In blue, you'll see a cliff collapse setback. And this is variable and classified into 7 setback categories according to cliff type, as set by Golder Associates. And you can see that in the grey box to the right-hand side of the slide. And this can range from an additional 18 meters to a maximum of 65 meters. For the majority of sub-area 6, new setbacks are proposed to include the following additional possibilities. A flood inundation setback you'll see in pale blue. And these limits are variable to include storm surge flooding, such as a 1 in 100 year flood return event, plus tsunami flood inland limits. And here a policy of no new development is recommended. Secondly, in yellow, you'll see what's called a climate change adaptation setback. And again, this is variable and is estimated using the latest IPCC sea level rise projections, and additional setback distances are recommended based on the new sea level rise predictions that is set within the IPCC. So you can see this is the new way forward for this revised ICZM plan. So I'm now going to just spend a few moments to talk you through the 2 key parts of the revised plan, as mentioned by Dr. Brewster, so you're aware of the level of detail that's contained within them and how it seeks to address some of the issues facing sub-area 6. And put simply, you can see on the screen, the ICZM plan for sub-area 6 shall, at its core, seek to provide the guidance needed to ensure that the beauty of the coast and the safety of users is preserved. And I shall focus on these more specifically, on these issues more specifically in a moment. Part C of the plan represents an important part, which is focusing on the general policy guidance for different topics that apply within the coastal zone management area. And this part provides guidance for risk resilient ICZM from a national perspective to address the policy outcomes that are defined in volume 1 of the plan. And you can see on the screen that there are 10 topics that are covered that deal with the national management priorities that are relevant to the entire coastal zone management area of Barbados. Perhaps all of these are of relevance to sub-area 6 in one way or another. Emerging issues, for example, such as water recreational structures that are seen along this sub-area 6, such as at Mullins Bay, are addressed in particular detail within this part of the plan. As you can see from the yellow box to the right-hand side, each topic provides a description of the current status of the topic, followed by the possible national implications of not considering the specific topic and the impact this may have on delivering sustainable ICZM. And from that, management guidance is then presented on how the topic should be applied in a manner that better embraces climate and disaster resilience. Finally, actions are listed with recommendations on suitable lead organisations to take forward each proposed action. A timescale for implementation is given, and an indicator which shall be used to measure progress during the lifespan of the ICZM plan. Part E focuses on the implementation, and this will be a long-term and continuous process that involves a range of agencies, institutions and authorities, and this is often known as a whole of government approach. Some elements require immediate action and will be straightforward to incorporate into the day-to-day operations of responsible agencies. In certain situations, elements can be built onto existing arrangements or require possibly private individuals and the general public to support certain parts of the implementation process. There may also be the need for some new procedures and practices developed over time because of the considerable scope and variety of topics covered by the plan, including, as I've mentioned earlier, emerging issues that may arise. And as shown in this diagram, all 6 ICZM policy outcomes that were raised by Dr. Brewster are proposed to to be achieved through compliance to 4 priority areas as set out within these 4 pillars of the diagram. And that's namely the importance of collaboration, capacity to continue, commitment, and communication. And more detail on all of these 4 pillars are presented in detail within Part E of the report. A clear roadmap, as shown in this slide, is also designed to link the various national guidance actions, as presented in Part C, to the 6 ICZM policy outcomes. And each specific action is then assigned to one or a range of ICZM policy outcomes as appropriate. And these are then assigned a specific roadmap timeline, as shown by the different coloured stars below, such as roadmap 1, which will be short term, maybe 2 years, roadmap 2, a medium term event, which should be 2 to 5 years, and roadmap 3, which is more long term, between 5 and 10 years. So you can see in Part E, it goes into quite considerable detail into a range of important supporting implementation topics, including information needs and data management, education, training and public outreach, institutional and capacity related needs, evaluation and monitoring procedures, and importantly, financial considerations. And on this latter point, no formal figure has currently been set with regard to the budget required to formally implement this plan. However, following all these 8 public inquiry meetings, efforts will be undertaken to fine-tune the range of actions proposed so that more targeted values can be placed on plan delivery over the coming 10 years. And so to this end, this slide briefly shows the intended development cycle for the plan. And you'll see the tick that just came on the screen, which declares that the Coastal Zone Management Unit with IH Cantabria have prepared the updates to the ICs to the 1998 plan. This will then be modified to reflect all comments received during this public inquiry process. Once the government of Barbados are happy with these updates, then the plan shall then need formal approval so that the unit can then begin to make the plan effectual on the ground, and it shall then be formally monitored and revised every 10 years, or as required or requested by the director of the Coastal Zone Management Unit. So my final presentation just builds on these earlier discussions, but focuses more briefly on the specific features of Sub-Area 6, coupled with a brief description of the various maps that have been produced. And this extends, as you know, Sub-Area 6 extends along the leeward west coast of the island. Land use immediately adjacent to the coast is principally influenced by tourism, as mentioned by Alison, but this is in combination with infrastructure combined with residential areas, including communities and settlements ranging from Maycock's Bay to the north, Sixmen's Bay, Haywoods, Speightstown, Mullins, Lower Carlton, moving south to Holetown, Sandy Lane to Paynes Bay, and then southwards to Fitz Village and Prospect towards Batt's Rock. So in a nutshell, and as you well know, this West Coast is an urban tourism corridor, and it's vulnerable to water quality issues, severe beach erosion at times, beach carrying capacity issues, and development setback challenges. And the coastal hazards facing this sub-area have been recently manifested themselves in business closure issues, such as experienced at Mullins Beach and at Sherman's Beach areas. And likewise, cliff collapse events have been recently noticed towards Mount Standfast and further to the south at Fitz Village. And this slide reconfirms the key issues that are facing this sub-area. Importantly, how the ICZM plan intends to address these through the implementation of 4 strategic objectives to the right-hand side that focus on enforcing setbacks, ensuring beach access in line with sustainable beach carrying capacity limits, improving bathing water quality, and reducing coastal risks that are caused by coastal storm surges and subsequent erosion. This slide is taken from Part D of the plan. And based on the risks and features known in Sub-Area 6, it shows that there's a series of possible actions that could be considered. And you'll see on the left-hand side that each possible action is assigned to Sub-Area 6, is aligned to the revised general guidance topics which have already been discussed to you. For example, you can see that each action is given a unique code, and highlighted in pink, you'll see a couple of examples or one example for discussion. This is under general guidance topic entitled beach management, and an action is defined to evaluate beach enhancement intervention projects within a more national beach management plan. And these projects could include, for example, projects proposed at Clinkits in St. Lucie to protect the road at Sand Street. Secondly, projects proposed to protect the old Speightstown Road and the development that's taking place in Speightstown. And the the area between St. Peter's Bay and Mullins Beach, which I'm sure you know has been impacted over the last 18 months to 2 years with significant erosion. And of course, much more detail is provided in the revised draft plan. And if you have not had time to review those, I urge you to review parts C and D in particular, where you can find more specific details on Sub-Area 6. And the plan is downloadable from the CZMU's website. Just running through a few maps, this slide shows the legend or the key that's been produced for all description related maps in Part D of the plan. And you can see these maps show environmental features, natural or restricted areas, and coastal classification types, such as whether the coast is eroding, accreting or stable, or if there's any flood related hazards falling within the defined coastal zone management area. And using one simple example from Half Moon Fort in the north down to Speightstown to the south, it can be seen that there's a range of natural and artificial coasts. Notable, the artificial coast, notably at the Nicky Beach development south of Sixmen's Bay, as well as other new tourist development areas. And there remains a significant flood risk along this whole stretch, as can be seen by the blue hazard zones. And as a consequence of these features, and with regard to setback policies, we can see in this part of Sub-Area 6 that there are recommendations for landscape setback. Specific cliff collapse setback distances are also defined, and these will be subject to different cliff classifications that are given to this area as defined earlier in my presentation. Let's just go back. Yeah, for the remaining stretch from Harrison's Point, we can see the consequence of this climate change adaptation setback areas and the implication that that's going to have on future development proposals that may be put forward to town and country planning in the future. So before I pass over to Ricardo, I just want to raise one more final poll, and this is to get your perspective on whether you believe that this particular sub-area is going to benefit as a priority from new engineering support, and score 1 if you think none is needed, or 5 if you think that engineering support, be it hard, soft, or a mix or hybrid approach is needed. Secondly, score whether you think new social measures are needed to improve vulnerable community resilience to coastal hazards. Again, scoring 1 to 5. And thirdly, whether you feel that new economic measures are needed in this sub-area to help support local fisherfolk or tourist beach businesses or marine area management in this particular area. And this will give us a perspective as to the integrated nature of this ICZM plan. This is not necessarily a a plan to dictate where engineering needs to happen. It has to go hand in hand with the socioeconomic aspirations of this area. So the results from that survey are implying that there's probably in this particular sub area, that there is a 36 and a 29%, quite a high demand for engineering interventions in this area. From a social perspective, half of you are saying that, yeah, this is a much needed measure for the plan to consider. And from an economic perspective, again, similar sort of statistic and a similar sort of demonstration of results. So I think we can conclude from this that the actions that the plan needs to focus on need to not only be engineering, but they need to go hand in hand with socio-economic sort of building back better for the future. So I'll pass over to Ricardo, who will give his presentation on the financing and the cost implications of this plan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Alison, can you see the screen?
I can see you.
And you can see the presentation as well? No?
I can't see the presentation as yet.
Let me try again to share my screen.
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, great.
Good.
So, right, good evening, everyone. So just want to look very quickly at what we really mean when we talk about disaster risk management and coastal zone management, because we've been doing hazard analysis for a very long time, and we all are aware of the vulnerability of different sectors of the coastline. But for the first time, we are applying an economic lens, and we think this economic lens will be transformational in terms of how we go about having discussions with developers, and also too in terms of how developers react. The image on the screen, the little cartoon, represents what often occurs in terms of the relationship between the regulators and the developer. The developer has an incentive to maximize returns on an investment, and that often results in trying to use up as much space as possible on a plot of land. And the regulators, we on our end, we are trying our best to protect and maintain already threatened resources. So before I get into the economic side of things, it's very important to understand that before we start to look at the numbers and start to do evaluations, we look very carefully at the science. So what you see here is how we would have assessed the cliffs in Barbados. So previously, you'd had a situation where you had a setback from a cliff that was based on an estimate of a recession rate of the cliff, as well as an estimate of how far there was an undercut in terms of how far the waves had eroded the bottom of the cliff through years of crashing against them. What we did, if you look at the image to the right, we brought in consultants that actually flew drones, and the drones use radar technology. And what you're seeing on this screen is some of the outputs of the radar technology. So the main image is actually a 3D rendering of the cliff based on the drone footage. And the bottom left-hand corner, what you'll see is the hatch. The yellow hatch is the actual measured undercut. So for the first time, we know exactly where the undercut is. We also did boreholes at different locations, so we know the strength of the rock. So we're not using any type of estimation. We're basically telling you these are the safe zones for you to put your structures based on engineering analysis. So the science has significantly improved in that regard. In relation to storm surge, wave overtopping, which will affect obviously beaches and low-lying areas. The science has also significantly improved. What we see here is image showing the hurricane tracks over the last 50 years. All hurricanes which passed within 500 kilometers of the island and would have affected our way of claiming. So using this information as well as some synthetic hurricane analysis to go back to the periods of time where we didn't have the technology to actually have the tracks, we developed a database of 100 years of hurricanes and how they could have affected Barbados. Lastly, just looking in terms of the science part of it, what you see here is an aerial of Needham's Point. The green line is something I will show you a little later, a profile line. So we flew an airplane and used the same radar technology as the drones on the cliff to be able to pick up all the points on land and in the water, so we know all the water depths and the land heights, the topography. So when you're looking at how a wave behaves, you know, the more information you have in terms of the details that you have in terms of the water depths, which determine how the wave transforms as it reaches the coastline, the better. So our models had this type of information. So if you move from the lower right-hand corner to the left of the screen, you will see in blue, that's the water, that's the depth of the seabed. If you recall from the image, there's a breakwater and there's a little kind of hump around 160, and then there's the beach. So all the brown, then it goes into the vegetation, which is shown in green. And right at the left of the screen, you see the red, which represents the rooftop of the structures. So this is the type of quality data that we use to analyze the hazards prior to looking at assessing the actual risk, which is the financial ends. Now, this simple graphic represents the value of the work outputs of Coastal Zone Management Unit. So the coastal and marine assets are listed on the left-hand side, beaches, coral reefs, etc. The natural, and then there's the built environment, coastal property, and the infrastructure. So these assets provide goods and services to the population of Barbados, including recreation, the beaches, cultural, let's say aesthetic appeal, tourism revenue, of course, or tourism product rather, and human well-being in general, you know, recreation, exercise, etc. And that those goods and services can be valued in terms of revenue. So what jobs are created on the coastline? What is the associated avoided health costs with people that, for example, go on the boardwalk and exercise every day? There are creative economic models to gain an understanding of how you can actually quantify the benefits of these things. Obviously, in terms of the infrastructure, managing the infrastructure will result in avoided damage to the infrastructure. And then that too will result in reduced disruption to business. So after a storm occurs, you'll be back up and running in no time because you built using certain guidelines, which basically minimize your damage in a storm event. And also when you invest and enhance the natural and the built environment in that way, there's a increased willingness to pay for people to actually want to invest more in protecting these assets once they understand this representation here in terms of the benefits that are derived from doing so. Now, when we're talking about disaster risk management, specifically, we're looking at assets like beaches, coastal property, and coastal infrastructure. And the services provided, obviously, tourism, recreation, cultural, and other things that we spoke of earlier. And the economic value specifically would be the avoided damages to the infrastructure by implementing measures, mitigation measures to reduce the potential damage. The good thing about it is that when you look at it through an economic lens, you can look at the most cost-effective way to mitigate your losses. So as part of the project, you want to look at this entire table. There's a requirement to have a evaluation done by an independent consultant. And if you look at row 5, you will see that there is an estimate of $70 million. Now that, let me just explain that a little bit. So the government of Barbados borrowed $28 million US from the IDB. And this is saying that if there is implementation of the policies that we are proposing in relation to protecting the beaches, the avoided damage, the avoided losses to tourism revenues, which is how the beaches are valued, which is a very narrow type of valuation, but it has its purpose. Over the lifetime of the repayment of the loan is approximately $70 million. So the beaches provide a service, so to speak, in different ways, but just in terms of tourism revenue over the next 25 years, by protecting and implementing some of the policy guidelines that we're proposing, this is the estimated savings over that timeline. So when a developer starts to think about the contribution that their individual property can make to this, understanding the importance of protecting the beach, the whole thrust towards development will change. So just to be clear, so we're not monetizing our natural assets for trade. We are maintaining our focus of natural resource protection and beach erosion management. But this is a new tool in our toolkit where we're quantifying the benefits to be derived from the controls that we continue to want to implement, to seek to implement. And we strongly believe that the realization of the importance of maintaining these economic benefit flows will create a clear incentive to invest in resilient infrastructure and follow planning guidelines. Thank you very much. I turn it back over to you, Alison.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. At this point in time, it's our question and answer session. And I hope all of you have your questions or your comments ready. As I mentioned, we would like you to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Or if you do need to make an urgent intervention, raise your hand and we will open the mic for you. As I mentioned earlier, we have a multidisciplinary team who is more than capable of responding to your questions and your queries. And when you type your question, obviously we have your name. So we will be calling your name. And if you the mic is open, please you state your name and your organization. So it's our question and answer time. Panelists, are you ready? And just indicate panelists who will be available, who is ready and willing to answer the questions for me by raising your hand as well. So I look forward to a good, robust discussion on this sub area here tonight. We have some questions already in our question and answer feature. And the first one, Mr. Innes, Samuel Innes is asking, why wasn't this stretch of beach not broken into more sub areas? This is a great area, and I think to deal with it in one go, he mentioned that, but why wasn't this area broken down into different sub areas? This large stretch from Maycock's Bay to Batt's Rock. Any of you panelists would like to answer this question for me, please? Please raise your hand.
Alison. Good night, Alison. Good night, Alison. Antonio Rowe here, Deputy Director. I'll take that one very quickly. So good night, everybody. The reason that the subsectors are the way they are is really not so much in terms of the distance or how long the length of shorelines and those kind of things. What really informed them was the actual characteristics of the shorelines, and I'll break that down very quickly. The way the subsectors are broken out, you would realize that the sections, each sector has a similar type of shoreline. So, for instance, the one we're in now, the sandy beaches all along that sector, and the offshore conditions that they're exposed to are the same. So it is, all that is the same. If you look at the subsector before, it's more a northwestern sector with cliffs and pocket beaches. So it's a similar type of shoreline with a similar orientation to the oceanographic conditions, and the exposure to the oceanographic conditions are the same. And that's similar for all these subsectors as you go around. So it's more a geomorphological coastal engineering type way they were divided. So the West Coast, this particular subsector from Maycock's right down to Batt's Rock, you can see it's western facing, straight. All the conditions exposed are the same, and the type of shoreline is the same. Sandy beach, all the way along. So that's the division. That's how they divided. And if you were to look at all the subsectors, you would see that they have that similar type characteristics for all of them. All right.
Thank you very much, Antonio. I see Jonathan, you wanted to follow up from Antonio?
Yeah, very briefly. Thanks, Antonio. And adding to all that information, another thing to sort of bear in mind is that you can have managed coastal management plans that have, for example, eight subdivisions as we have. And I've seen other islands, such as the Seychelles, that have an ICZM plan, and they've divided their coast up into probably about 40 to 50 units. Now, whilst you could argue that both are as just as effective, a policymaker sometimes would find a break of a plan into 40 units being really unmanageable. So a balance had to be reached. And in terms of the coastal zone management unit's future remit to implement this plan, as long as that sub area has consistent characteristics and a consistent theme, then it's probably better to acknowledge that there are nuances and differences between the various bays, but have one consistent sub area. And that's probably the main reason why sometimes it's inappropriate to cut them down into too much detail, because when it comes to implementation, it actually becomes really difficult to justify that break and then to justify the economic impact of that break on an adjacent stretch. So there's exactly what Antonio said, but there's also some of the management implications in the long term. So I hope that provides an answer.
Mr. Ennis, I hope we've answered your question. Mr. Ennis also has another question. Does the CZMU have a detailed profile for any of the beaches of Barbados? Please indicate, panelists, which one of you will be willing to take on this question. Do we have detailed profiles for the beaches around the island? I see Leo has indicated he will answer this question. Go ahead, Dr. Brewster.
Hi, Alison. Yeah, thanks for the question. We don't have a profile on every single beach on this island, but we have over 110 to 110 profile lines around the island. So we cover just about every single beach as best as we can. The priority areas, obviously, with the greatest number of beaches being covered along the west and south coast, and then along the southeast coast in the areas where we have some of the pocket beaches, we have those identified. And then with the greatest spacing going up the east coast, we have all the major beach locations along the east coast covered as well. The area that has probably the fewest amount of coverage is the north coast, principally because access down to those pocket beaches for the most part is generally very restricted. and there's not an easy way to get down to all of those public beaches. So we can say, yes, we have the island covered generally. There are other ways that you could also generate your own profiles if you were interested, whereby you could look at such things as aerial photography and do changes in width through time, etc., through distance measurement and that sort of stuff. But we do have, like I said, over 120 beaches. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a beach that you may be interested in will have a profile line on it, but we may have a profile location very, very close to it along the way, which is the other reason why, as Antonio and Jonathan rightfully pointed out, the continuity of the West Coast clearly defines that a lot of the activities taking place there are influenced by characteristics that are consistent, stretching from Maycock to Batt Rock all the way along.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buster. I see Jonathan has his hand up again to follow up your answer to that question.
Yeah, thanks. And to add to Dr. Brewster's comments, if Mr. Ennis's question was to do with sort of carrying capacity of beaches and, you know, the profile as to who uses it, so it's almost like the human side of it, that's the responsibility of the NCC and not the Coastal Zone Management Unit. However, the revised ICZM plan does have a clear action in there with a signpost for the NCC to promote a national beach management strategy, which would help to support a future international standard. And to do that, they would need to have a much better understanding of beach carrying capacity to better understand zoning issues, beach use issues, health and safety related matters. But that is an NCC role, but it is included in the plan.
Thank you, Jonathan. So, Mr. Ennis, I hope we've been able to answer your two questions this evening. I have a question from Anne Harding. Anne Harding has asked, why would only major developments that fall within the setback distance be subject to environmental impact review? Her emphasis is on within the setback distance. Panelists, please indicate which one of you will be willing to answer this question for Anne Harding. Fabian, thank you for raising your hand. Please proceed. We can hear you now, Fabian.
Okay, good evening to all.
Good evening.
The answer basically relates to magnitude of impact and diversity of impacts, okay? So realistically, if you have a small charter house on the coast, of which we still have a few, and the property owner wants to conduct renovations and redevelopment of the site of similar magnitude, you wouldn't expect any significant impacts on the marine environment in such a case. However, if you have a large resort type development, inclusive of offshore works, which normally accompanies that type of development, you would certainly expect impacts to the coastal marine environment and the ecosystem services that ecosystems provide, and even shoreline processes in terms of sediment transport, etc. And impacts in the social context in terms of other stakeholders, the neighbors, beach users, etc., in terms of noise, dust, vibrations, traffic impacts, etc. So I hope that responds adequately to your question. You can let us know if that was adequate. Thank you.
Thanks, Fabian. I see Jonathan wanted to add to this this answer as well. No? All right. Thank you, Fabian. Okay, that's all right. Ms. Harding, thank you for your question, and I hope we've been able to answer your question. I have a question from Mark Brian Thompson. He says he was trying to understand the economic bit. it would be good to understand what is taken into consideration when coming up with the formula. So I think the person who was dealing with this is Ricardo. Ricardo, perhaps you could elaborate on the economic analysis for the Mr. Thompson for me, please.
Hi, good night again. So what we've basically done is look at adding quantification of potential losses to hazard analysis. So in the past, you would have developed a storm surge line and said, this is the probability of 1 in 100 event. This is the extent to which this will impact the shoreline. And these are the properties within that area. What we're doing now is actually looking at the value of properties. It's not at the level yet of every single structure, but we're looking at a value of a sample of structures within a sector, and then using that to kind of extrapolate, make some assumptions in relation to the entire sector, and seeing the 1 in 50 event or the 1 in 100 event will cause this amount of damage, and there's actually a dollar figure associated with it. And then we're looking at the same thing for hurricane winds, the same thing for cliff collapse, potential cliff collapse, tsunami. So it really is just looking at the level of financial damage caused by the hazards. But the important thing is to look at how you can then go about mitigating these losses in a cost-effective way. And also to making clear plans, like looking at the cost benefit of policy decisions as well as individual properties, implementing shoreline protection and enhancement, etc. And obviously then there will be implications in terms of the discussion about how people treat the financial management of risk at property level, insurance and other things. So I hope that explains it. So we're basically just looking at a structure, looking at the characteristics of the buildings, etc., and coming up with an assessment of the value of the damage to be caused by different extreme events.
Thanks, Ricardo. Mr. Thompson, just type and let me know if you've been able to answer your question. I have to go back to a question from Ms. Harden. She said she should have asked, why would we allow major developments within the setback? She's changed the question a little bit. Why would we allow major developments within the setback? Panelists, please indicate which one of you will be answering this question. Fabian, thank you, and go ahead, please.
Hello, good evening again. In many cases, you already have much of the properties within the sub area existing. All right. Also, there are a number of reasons why historically a particular development may fall within the setback. So recognizing the narrow width of properties, coastal properties, particularly on the West Coast, narrow meaning the area between the high water mark and the coastal road. Imagine what the situation would be if those were not allowed to continue to exist there. And the knowledge of what type of infrastructure being, as was mentioned in the previous presentation tonight, over 80% of the tourism plan exists there. So in short, what I'm going to say is that a lot of the, for want of a better term, development use right already exists in those areas. So what we do is that where such developments already exist, we try not to encourage the development in terms of our recommendations to make themselves more vulnerable by going any further seaward, and we try to take advantage of any additional setbacks that we can impose where possible. I recognize that we would have individuals here from PMO, Mr. Leach, etc., that may be able to provide a slightly more different perspective. And I will be, so I would give way to them. But in short, from our perspective, in terms of making our recommendations, in a nutshell, it is as simple as that. I don't know if anybody else has any slightly different perspective, but I would aim there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian. I think you answered the question well.
Good night, Alice.
Antonio, you would want to add to Fabian's comments?
Small little thing in that you must remember that a property owner who owns a piece of land on the in the coastline, I never defer to the planners at this after what he said because I don't want to mislead. But if you own a property on the coast and it's already within the setback, and you would wish to develop it, I am not sure how you could not allow it. And other than the land itself being public government, I don't think you can disadvantage somebody who has a piece of property and not allow them to develop it. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So, but as Fabian was saying, it will be developed within the parameters, the best parameters that would negate any adverse impacts either on the coastline or structure itself. So I don't know if any of the planners want to add on to that.
Fabian is going to come back again. All right, Fabian?
Yeah, sorry, just to be brief, what we try to do now going forward is to include additional recommendations to the setbacks, such as to encourage those individuals redeveloping those properties within the setback to take advantage of additional measures such as looking at the elevation of their ground floor in terms of the foundation, not having essential services or infrastructure at beach level, so therefore to mitigate against storm surge inundation, and in many cases, storm water inundation where water settles and raises flood heights as well. So that is important to know as well. Thank you.
Okay. I thank you very much, Fabian and Antonio. Ms. Harding, I hope we've been able to answer your question. I have another question here from Chesterfield Marshall. He has asked, what is the impact on the coastline of the construction of Port St. Charles and more recently, Port Ferdinand? What is the impact of these two port activities in St. Peter, Port St. Charles and Port Ferdinand? Please, panelists, please let me know who will be tackling this particular question. Thank you. The director, please go ahead, Dr. Brewster.
Thanks a lot, Alison. These two developments were unique in their own right. The first one being that Port St. Charles was the first marina that was ever built in Barbados. And it went through extensive modeling and design works, especially because of the same concern that we had as we expressed earlier, where it was felt that some form of impact on sediment dynamics or how sand is moving along the coastline could have been impacted, and those were mitigated against. And that facility has worked very well for the length of time that it's been in operation. To the immediate north of that was Port Ferdinand, which came up most recently, I think probably within the last 20 years or so. And that too went through extensive modeling works to look at its own impact, more importantly, not only to the northern section of the coastline, but also to his immediate neighbor, Port St. Charles, because there was a very narrow beach between the two of them that used to be very prominent. What we have noticed in recent years was that the narrow beach, which was at the open window there between the two of them, has narrowed considerably over the years. And that was pretty much more or less something that was expected. It did show up in the modeling work. And what was supposed to happen is that as part of the clearing of the channel, which acts now as a sink in the entry to Port St. Charles, the sediment from there is supposed to be pumped back onto that beach at least twice a year once the channel needs clearing, to ensure that some level of functional or recreational occupancy can still take place there. And that does happen. I think one of the other things to note as well is that given the type of new developments that are taking place to the north of the island, we have to be also more concerned about the potential for the deflection of sand offshore, which could take it out of the nearshore sediment stream, which is in essence saying that if you push the sand out too far, it will not be able to follow the coastline as closely as it should normally, and that would impact on sediment. But generally, the two of them have worked over their lifetime so far quite stably and confidently within the areas that they are working.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brewster. I hope we've been able to answer your question. I have a question. Mr. Chesterfield Marshall would like to expand on his question. Can you please open the mic for him, please? He would like to expand on his question. Mr. Chesterfield Marshall. Go ahead, Mr. Marshall.
Pleasant good night to all.
Good night.
Well, Dr. Brewster spoke of the immediate area around the two ports. I'm more concerned about the damage being done to the south, especially in the Gibbs's Mullins area. I'm of the view that those structures to the north have impacted negatively, especially in the area there in Spikestown by the Fisherman's Pub, and further south, as far south as Mullins, and even further south. I recall many years ago when there was the initiative to place the Barbados Coast Guard in Oystins area. When that particular development, after all the studies would have shown, resulted in the inability of the boats to actually get into the area that was built for them. And then we have today a nice beach called Miami Beach. So there are things that happen, and whereas in the immediate area, there may not be an impact, we see those things downstream. I know that because I live on the West Coast. I'm a waterman on the West Coast, and I see it all the time. That's all I wanted to retort to Dr. Brewster and others listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Marshall. Dr. Brewster, do you have a response to Mr. Marshall's comments?
Hi, yeah, okay. I really and truly don't want
anyone that's on the panel.
Right, I don't want to get into any sort of like back and forth on these sort of issues. I think that Mr. Marshall has made his point very clear in terms of his own perceptions. From our own scientific analysis that we've done, we know and we could beg to differ. I think also that a lot of the damage that I've also seen in the area of Spikestown has also possibly a different source that could relate to the focusing of waves in and around the same Spikestown jetty, and then the other impacts that also extend from the volume of water that flows out from the salt pond that causes significant erosion down in front of Fisherman's Pub, heading south in front of the former Hare Zone, etc. That was a different sort of issue. And there's been some hardening down in that area as well that might have also contributed to the erosion in the area. So I'm not really truly going to get into the back and forth on that. But as with most things, you know, you can have a situation whereby deflected waves may be able to change their orientation and impact a shoreline a little further down than we would have modeled. What normally happens is that whenever we're doing modeling, we model at least half a kilometer on either side of the structure that we are working to ensure that we know the dynamic stability of those areas there. And I think that that is more than sufficient for the type of work that we've done, for all the work that we've been working on. And when we do have major developments that are looking to do that sort of work within the coastal space, we also ask for them to model physically those same sort of parameter characteristics that we do as part of our own work. And those applicants normally comply.
Okay, thank you.
And also present their findings to us as part of their reporting procedures for town planning.
All right, Ricardo is going to comment here as well. Ricardo?
I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So typically in coastal engineering, there's a zone of influence associated with structures. So you build a structure like a groin, and it has an impact on a specific section of shoreline. What the gentleman is referring to in relation to Miami Beach, that groin was built. The south coast, of course, is very different from the west coast, and all the sand is moving like a river towards Needham's Point, towards town. So you would have a buildup on one side, and then at beach will build up and spread towards the east. And then you would have a consequent reduction on the downdrift side. But there's a specific distance over which these structures can affect the shoreline. And what would happen is that after the beaches build out on the updrift side, if you can imagine sand moving from west to east on Miami Beach, sorry, from east to west on Miami Beach, after it builds up on the updrift side, then it starts to bypass naturally. But as Dr. Bruce was saying, so we in coastal engineering, what you look at is letting that process happen as quickly as possible. So the sediment bypassing is part of the design, where you would implement structures and actually nourish and artificially place sand, so that basically you enhance a section of shoreline without causing a subsequent buildup and reduction in beach width on the downdrift side. So it would be very difficult to point to a source of erosion so far south in terms of Mullins and attribute that to something as far north as where Port Ferdinand is. And I think we have to look at some of the complexities that exist within those bays. There's a lot of losses during swell events. There are also other projects that have been done to enhance, that we have monitored and looked at their response and so on. So, we just have to look at it very carefully and understand that, there are processes, coastal processes that operate within specific zones of influence, and be careful not to attribute what is happening a distance away from structures to structures which really are outside, areas which are really outside of the zone of influence of those structures.
All right, thank you very much for the question, Mr. Marshall. I think Ricardo and Dr. Brewster did justice to your question. We have a question from Susan Mahon. She says, is with respect to access to information. She says the scientific and technical information presented is impressive, and we thank you for that compliment, Ms. Mahon. Can individuals and/or organizations like the Coral Reef Restoration Alliance be given access to detailed information about their areas of interest? For example, the detailed information collected about the terrestrial and coastal area at Vauxhall, where Coral's pilot coral nursery is now located. Can one member of the panel please help to answer this question? As
All
we
right,
go up to
Alison, I can do that.
15, as we go up to a quarter to 8,
Right.
as
I
we
will
know
do
our
that.
deadline is at 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
Dr. Brewster, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Unfortunately for Mrs. Mahan, the reality is that the information hasn't been released yet from cabinet, so we wouldn't be able to make it available as yet. But as with most things, once given the nature of the type of work that it is, once we can get the permission, we will try and make it available as best we can. Okay. The level of detail of the sort of information that you may be looking for may be not as specific as you would like, but you will be able to access some level of information once we can get the permission from cabinet.
Ms. Mahon, I hope you'll be able to answer your question. Dr. Brewster provided, I think, a concise answer to your question, but we are always available to answer any more questions to you and the other participants here tonight. We have a question from an anonymous source. It says, at some point in time, we will need to admit that some existing developments are now in wrong places, and wrong is in quotation marks, due to sea level rise and increased storm surges, climate change. Can anyone here answer this question about the wrong places? On the panel, please indicate by raising your hand. And that is Dr. Brewster again. Dr. Brewster, you're a busy man tonight.
Hey, looking so. I don't know what happened, guys. Come on, you got to help me with these things. I don't know if it's a question of being in the wrong place. As with most things, over time and through different types of development that have taken place along the coastline has changed. Okay, you can't always expect that everything is going to remain in its natural state as it was at the time of settlement or as time has passed over the last 60 years. I think what has happened that also has to be recognized is that given the type of development that we have, as Fabian rightfully pointed out, we do not have the option of full-fledged retreat or relocation. So therefore, we normally take the position that we're going to be holding the line as best we can where we can. In order to achieve that, we have certain conditions that are applied to all developments from our office to ensure that there's some level of protection and stability to the coastline as we go forward. And where we have situations for new developments or redevelopments taking place, where the necessary setback further landward can be accommodated, we always try to insist that that does take place. But we don't have a situation, whereas in other countries, you can just say we have to up and relocate. That is something that I don't think Barbados will ever be able to easily accede to. I mean, if we get hit with a Category 5 storm, then maybe new things would have to be considered, similar to what happened in the Bahamas, etc. But at this point in time, we literally try to ensure to the best of our ability that any development that is going to be taking place on any part of the coastline has to adhere to specific conditions that we would be recommending to the planning office.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brewster. I see John has his hand up to answer as well.
Yeah, thanks. It's the thing is with ICZM is that, and any coastal management around the world, is that it's what's called an iterative process. And iterative means you basically learn as you go along. Now, I mean, Barbados is in quite a unique position because it has a really strong, it has a strong CV, putting it simply, in terms of having decades of experience. But as Dr. Brewster quite rightly said, it's got experience based on its terrain and what hand it's been dealt with. And on one hand, you know, dealt with a beautiful, beautiful coastline, but secondly, dealt with the pressures that a beautiful coastline, you know, brings. So I've seen many examples around the world of, let's say, development in wrong places, as the question was presented. But those wrong places, at the time the decision was made, was deemed to be acceptable from a, let's say, a hold the line perspective. In time, and as we've learned from the increasing pressures of climate change, all of a sudden a potentially right decision is very quickly a wrong decision. Now, what the coastal zone management are doing in this revised plan is learning from that, and it's building on this iterative process of coastal zone management. And that iterative process is a journey, and Barbados has got to make sure that that journey doesn't bury the golden egg, kill the goose that lays the golden egg, as Anne has stated in her comment. And that is being addressed by bringing in this new modality of considering ecosystem-based adaptation, considering hybrid approaches to defense mechanisms, and learning from the mistakes in tandem with developing this, letting the science dictate the policy. So yes, we've all seen situations with some strange decisions on the coast, and I'm not going to go down where, but they are there. But the iterative process allows the unit and allows the country to learn from that and build on it. And as Dr. Brewster said, be resilient in its policy setting for the future.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have another question from anonymous attendee as well. And there are two questions which I will link together. It says huge piles of enormous rough rocks are being placed on beaches to protect developments. These installations are preventing locals and visitors from accessing beaches. Is there not a better way? I'll ask the second question after someone answers this. And the person who will respond to this is Shamari Cave. Go ahead, Shamari.
Okay, hi, good night.
Good night.
Well, the rocks that the attendee is speaking of, it could either be groins or a revetment. In this case, both of them are shore stabilization structures. And what is tried to be done, we try to retain the lateral access while designing these structures. So for example, like a revetment, we try to maintain a pathway at the top of the revetment that provides lateral access. And for groins, in a situation where groins, the attendee said, might be preventing lateral access, that might be a case after a storm event or some abnormal wave event, which causes erosion of the beach cell, which removes the sand, and it might cause a blockage of lateral access. But this is not a normal trend because the sand normally returns to the cell. So it may just be a one-off in that case. But most of the time, we try to preserve the lateral access when constructing these structures.
Thank you very much. I see John has his hand up as well. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks,
Shamari.
And
followed by Ricardo.
Just to add to that, it's a signpost to the revised plan. I'd recommend that person to take a look at, in the general guidance note under the topic of beach management. We've got quite a lot of recommended guidance now on lateral access and beach access points, building in appropriate lateral access based on the carrying capacity of a certain pocket cove or certain stretch of beach. So to answer your question, it's a very good point, but the plan is addressing that for the future. And I'd recommend taking a look at the beach management section in general guidance part C.
And Ricardo?
Yeah, just to add a little more. So if we look at the evolution of coastal engineering on the island, we moved from a situation where individual properties were primarily looking to enhance or mostly protect in front of them. And sometimes if they were looking to enhance, they put in groins and then there was a negative downdrift impact. What's happening now is that engineering has evolved to dealing with 1.5 kilometer stretches of shoreline with a focus on maintaining lateral access and enhancing beaches. So, things have changed dramatically. And when you deal with a kind of comprehensive engineering design, which deals with, which also includes stakeholder consultation and make sure it addresses all kind of other social issues as well. It's a different output. So there may be some, relic situations that exist as described, but from the CIP to our recent project, we have looked at things holistically, with lateral access being one of the primary objectives of the work.
Thank you, Shamari, Jonathan, and Ricardo. You have a question about, is there a plan for soft engineering? For example, the planting of coastal vegetation in the draft. Are there any plans to use soft engineering around the coast? One of you, my colleagues, please feel free to answer this question. I don't see any hands as yet. I have Jonathan and I have the director, Dr. Brewster. Jonathan, you go first, and then
yes,
Dr.
before
Brewster.
the director. Yeah, I just typed an answer back to the to the person, but basically the main essence of this revised plan is to introduce the concept of ecosystem-based adaptation and hybrid solutions, which is a combination of hard and soft schemes. So there's again a strong focus of that within this revised plan, and maybe Dr. Brewster wishes to specifically sort of add to that point.
Right, thanks a lot, Jonathan. Yes, just to build on that, there are avenues for the use of soft options along the way. But remember, soft options also include things like setback requirements, not just the use of vegetation. Vegetation is essential, as we know, for beach stability, which is very important, and we do look at it. But over the years, since we did our last revegetation project in the mid-90s, we've had considerable pushback from property owners against the government coming in and planting vegetation in front of properties. Okay, so while we would love to do it, we've had some consultations with some property owners where we know that some coastal segments could take revegetation as a way forward. The property owners have been a little resistant towards it, principally because they complain of issues of potential loitering and persons wanting to use the space for other activities which may be unbecoming. Then it becomes the issue of who's responsible for the maintenance of the vegetation once it's planted, etc., despite the fact that government would have been looking to be doing the maintenance along the way. And if you're planting certain types of trees, then when the trees get too tall, it then becomes a different issue in terms of who's responsible for trimming them, etc. As you can see, where we have done our revegetation work, it's not only been associated with all of our projects. So at Welch's, the Rocky Boardwalk, the whole town access way now stretching from Beachlands all the way up to Heron Bay. And we continue to do that as part and parcel of the work that we do. We've also done similar revegetation work in some areas of the East Coast as part of the 1998 study. And most recently, we have to give compliments to people at Wired up there by the sand pit in St. Andrew, the Walker's Sand Quarry, where they themselves have initiated a major revegetation program for some areas that had turned into moonscape because of off-roading, and it has been working very well. We have no problem meeting with property owners who may wish to consider beach revegetation, because we would be encouraging them to use the correct types of plants on the beach, especially the pioneer plant species that will actually actively hold sand during storms, and not just the ornamentals that will be burnt and pose other problems later on down. So yes, the short answer is yes. I just provided the long answer.
Okay, Addison, just want to add there very quickly then, very short answer. That there are some areas too, like on Parallel Bay's beach, Bronx Beach, where you do have the NCC. We do some vegetation pretty much in front of the government headquarters and properties owned by the Crown. And so you sometimes when we have large waves coming into the bay, you actually can see where the vegetation actually protects the beach, where you erode it right back to the vegetation, and the vegetation kind of holds the line. So it is being used, but the truth is that in terms of trying to design against beach erosion from oceanographic conditions, you know, you have to look at what those oceanographic conditions are. And so if we're looking at waves of a certain height, size, height, strength, or whatever, then vegetation may not be enough. And that is where the structures come in. So it's always based on what your inputs are for design and what you're trying to achieve. So I just want to put that in there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, Dr. Brewster, and Antonio. I have two final questions as we're about to go to a minute past 8 o'clock. And the question, Mr. Brian Thompson was responding to Ricardo's presentation and his follow-up. And he said that you answered the question, Ricardo, but he also recognizes it's a complicated thing to assess. However, he believes it's an excellent direction. It probably will take further in-depth discussion. It especially struck him when it was shown that an estimated savings of $70 million will be had in a particular area across the island. We also advised Mr. Thompson that we are always available to discuss this matter and any pertaining to Coastal Zone Management Unit with him. And we forwarded Mr. Arthur's email to Mr. Thompson as well. Do you want to add to this? And after that, I see the chairperson, Dr. Aline, she has her hand up. Anything you want to add to this, Ricardo?
Well, maybe just a reminder, the $70 million. So that was a very narrow valuation of beaches. So that was based solely on tourism revenue. Of course, there are a number of other inputs into the valuation of beaches, including protection as a buffer, recreational, cultural, etc., that can all be used to evaluate the beaches in terms of the benefits that flow towards society. And just so that he recalls exactly what I said, it is really that if you implement the policies to, if you implement the policy guidelines that we're proposing, you achieve $70 million, like that's the value of the beach that you're protecting specifically to the impacts of climate change in terms of sea level rise. So that is one of the major threats to our economic development and our tourism product.
Thanks for following up, Ricardo. I see Dr. Aline has her hand up. Go ahead,
Yes,
Dr. Aline.
thank you very much, Alison. Just a very quick point of clarity from Jonathan's presentation. He showed a very extensive area called a flood inundation zone or flood inundation area. And I think he said there was, the policy would be no new development. And I just wondered how that the application of those guidelines would work with respect to the same design options that were being encouraged in terms of raising the level of the building from the ground, things like that. So I just wanted to know how hard and fast was the no new development in the flood inundation zone, if you can just explain that.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
In the time we've got, I can't give you a true long answer, but the flood inundation zone is defined based on the 1 in 100 year flood return period. And so based on that analysis, the strong recommendation is that new development should not take place within that flood zone. What we've added on top of that is the climate change IPCC scenario sea level rise predictions on top of that, so that you've got a spread of low-lying land there which is strongly advised against new development, and that is hence the reason for the setback zone. I don't know if I can elaborate any further than that, but in the time we've got, but hopefully the main message is these setbacks are set there now, which weren't there in the 1998 plan, to help Coastal Zone Management Unit provide the justification for any new planning application that may fall within that zone.
That's helpful, Jonathan. It was just that it was such an extensive area is why it caught my eye, because it's a very wide area. So I just wondered it would affect very many people. So I thought people might want to hear how do they deal with that. Okay, thank you.
There's a lot of blue. I appreciate that. Yeah.
A lot of blue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali and Jonathan. We have one question now. And it says that Mr. Innes believes that the CZMU should look at building different kinds of structures and protecting our coast. And he says from his experience, breakwater / groins seem not to work as effective on the West Coast. Our engineers will be able to answer this question for us, whether they work or not on the West Coast. Ricardo, thank you for answering.
Okay, I think that perception is partly based on the fact that the West Coast there's a lot less sand. I won't say it's sandstorm, but there's a lot less sand moving on the West Coast. So on the South Coast, there are large volumes of sand moving in one direction. The West Coast is more complicated. There's not as much sand, and it depends on the time of year. It moves to the north, and then during the winter period, and there's the northerly swells. The dominant direction is to the south. However, what we found is that the swell activity on the West Coast is responsible for most of the erosion in terms of the day-to-day. And groins in isolation aren't effective because the sand is actually moved perpendicularly. So it moves from onshore to offshore. Groins help when sand is moving along the shore and you trap it. So what we have done in our projects is a combination of groins and breakwaters. For example, the project we recently did in Whole Town, there's a combination of groins and breakwaters, and you can see the impact of the breakwaters, especially in areas like Frampton, Mango Bay Hotel, Discovery, that you can actually see the beaches, which during the winter period, there was no beach. There is no continuous beach throughout the year. We also have to we also follow up in terms of monitoring. So we know what is the actual impact of our projects in terms of increased beach width over a specific duration. And we also know the reduction in losses experienced on the West Coast during the winter swell period. So we can provide some of that information, but we take the point in relation to it being a more difficult task to preserve the beaches on the West Coast because of the limited sand supply, and also to let's say the difference, the complexity associated with the movement of sand, and modeling a West Coast beach and trying to enhance it is a lot more difficult. But we do have evidence that the projects that we have implemented have produced more stable beaches and increased beach widths over the project areas.
All right, thank you, Ricardo. Then we have Dr. Brewster, who's gonna follow up.
Fabian before me.
Oh, Fabian, sorry, Fabian, go right ahead.
Thank you. Recognizing that the discussion around this issue of beach stabilization has been heavily engineering, I would just like to bring a little ecology into the equation. It is important to recognize that the sand that actually moves along the coast and that is trapped in place by the same size structures, such as the groins, etc., are actually a product of our living coral reefs. Okay? And it is important to recognize that the efforts to protect our coral reefs are central to the viability, the existence of the very beaches that we're talking about preserving. So I just want to table that and to balance the equation. If there's no sand being produced by our quarries, then no sand for these structures to retain. So we have to bear that in mind and recognize the ecosystem services of those natural resources that ecosystems that we have out there. All right, I'll hand over to the director.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ricardo and Fabian. I think that those points are all very much taken into account in terms of how we're looking at the impact of structures along the coastline. I think also what needs to be recognized is two things. First of all, coastal from the time of its inception has been looking at how structures can be modified from the traditional international design standard to meet and blend with our own coastal environment. And that's what we have done, okay? As you will see with several of our structures now, the groins themselves are normally built to be sloping into the water rather than perpendicular facing and being significantly elevated out of the water. We had changed we're practical for all of our projects to using granite, which is a stone which is more dense than limestone that we would be using and has greater longevity in terms of wear and tear. So therefore, you're reducing the need for replenishment, replacement over the years. I think also the use of the breakwaters themselves have also changed from what was happening in the past, where in the area of Haywoods, you had these sills being built in very, very shallow water to help with sand retention along the shoreline, and they're much further out now. When we first looked at doing breakwaters, we built the one at Rockley and the one at Weston, and those structures themselves were in about 15 feet of water, so 10 to 15 feet of water, and that is the normal sort of water depth that we have been placing them in. Within the CIP, Coastal Infrastructure Project, and also in the CRMP, we've also, which is the Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Program, we've also varied the structures of the breakwaters now to be a lot more, for want of a better word, broad in their scope to aid in the ability to dampen the waves or slow down the waves before they reach the shoreline, while retaining their submerged design, as compared to the Rockley breakwater and the Western breakwater, which were in very deep water and they were very erect in their structure. By sloping the structures themselves is allowed for a much more aesthetic component. It's provided new habitat surface area for corals to settle out on, juvenile corals to settle out on in the near shore. And I think all of these features have been of benefit. The problem that you face is even though we ask for developers and property owners to go through the same rigor that we go through in terms of design, many of them do, but yet still the type of structures that are built do not necessarily always conform to the best place designs that are required in some areas. And those are conditions, even though that when placed on by coastal, there's this need for potential follow-up in the future, which we have done, okay? So the perception that the breakwaters don't work all the time is maybe a valid one, but for the most part, they generally work very well. I think as Ricardo also pointed out, you have to use structures in combination. So in our case, we overnourish to ensure that there's always the bypassing of sediment. So you don't have a situation where a beach may feel that it is quote unquote starved because you're waiting for a structure to fill up with sand before it moves on down the shoreline as it would normally do. We overfill the structure to ensure that it's full of sand so that the bypassing continues. But you also have to put in certain types of groins in place to help anchor sand in place as part of a growing field along the way. I'm no coastal engineer. I leave it for my guys to talk. But those are the sort of things that you have to do along the way, and we've been working at it. I think what's going to start to be seen now, though, is that as with even when we were building the Richard Haynes boardwalk, some people thought that the structures were overly large because of their size and capacity. But as your eye over the years then adjusts, you forget what the original coastline used to look like. And I think that's also what's happening here now. But we also have to factor in for increased storminess, increased wave energy during swell events and during the hurricane season, and the possibility of greater nearshore damage in the absence of some of these structures. We as coastal do not want to really and truly be seen to be perpetuating the use of structures along the shoreline in all instances. It may be better to move offshore, but one thing also has to be remembered. We're getting to the point now where access to the coast for large vehicles to do major coastal engineering work is becoming more and more restricted, i.e. less and less available. And therefore, concepts in terms of how you're going to do the next phase of coastal works within the upcoming coastal project, as Jonathan rightfully pointed out, in the areas of Clinkett, Sand Street, and St. Peter's Bay to Mullins as three upcoming examples of where we're going to be doing work. These sort of activities now have to be looked at very seriously in terms of what can be done. So the use of soft options, including gray-green initiatives, in the sense that you're adding habitat to existing hard engineering structures or using softer options along the way, are going to be becoming more and more prominent, and they are spelled out within the plan. And I encourage everybody, as we're winding down these programs, to get out and continue reading the plan, to get a better appreciation as to what we have planned coming up, what we're going to be doing, and how this plan is going to be guiding us for the next 10 years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brewster. And we have one final question. Mr. Marshall has mentioned there's no mention of fishing and its impact. There's no mention of fishing and its impact tonight. Can someone give me a response to this final question? That's you, Fabian?
Yes, to be fair to Mr. Marshall's question, it's quite difficult to be brief in my response to this, but I will try to summarize as follows. I often don't like to single out fishermen because it can easily get into a chicken and egg situation. You have to recognize that the impacts to our reefs and our marine ecosystems represents a very complex ecological, social, and economic issue. Okay, you have international concerns such as climate change, which impact small island states with large oceans such as ourselves. You have issues of coastal water quality, which is influenced from land-based sources of marine pollution, as well as impacts from coming within our waters. Okay. So there is a multiplicity of issues that all work in tandem that will have an impact on fisheries. Because if the ecology, the health of our reefs are declining, it means that the reef as a habitat for fish is getting less diverse and less abundant in terms of the species, diversity, etc., which impacts on fisheries. But fishermen will try to earn a livelihood. So they have an impact on the reef in terms of their fishing effort, but there's also an impact on them in terms of the resource that they harvest. So yes, they were not mentioned, but the complexity of the issue, I believe, does not negate the necessity to zero in on fishing specifically. And I would love to explain to you more, but time will not permit that. Thank you.
And Mr. Marshall, if you need some more information on this, you can speak to any member of the unit, particularly Fabian, as he mentioned, at the Coastal Zone Management Unit, and the Fisheries Department as well. I'm sure they have lots of information to give to you as well. So at this time, we have concluded our question and answer session. I think Ricardo has a question.
Richard has a comment.
Richard, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Richard, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Richard Suku, marine biologist. I just wanted to add to what Fabian had said. So Mr. Marshall, I believe, is correct in that when he speaks to the mention of fishing and its impact, but only insofar as when we look at the guidance for the sub-area level. If you look at the national guidance, you will see that there is some mention made of fishing and the requirement to manage fishing as part of the integrated approach to coastal zone management. But it must be recognized, and Fabian would have touched on it, that we have to work in partnership with the various government agencies, with our sister agencies, to achieve this integrated management for various issues within the coastal zone. With this one, fisheries, the lead agency will of course be Fisheries Division. So the national guidance speaks specifically to supporting the fisheries management plans that will have been developed by Fisheries Division. So coastals, while it is included within the national guidance for the integrated coastal zone management plan, the lead agency for this issue would be the Fisheries Division. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. You can check the national guidance if you want a little more information as well.
Thank you, Richard. On that note, I will just ask Jonathan to do the 2 polls that he has now. And then Antonio, the Deputy Director, will do the vote of thanks.
Great, thank you, Alison. And thank you everybody for your attentive questions. We have 2 very simple poll questions for you now, which sort of bring together the discussions we've had. The first one is as follows. Could you give a score to how highly you would rate the intentions of what we've been talking about with regard to the updated ICZM plan? And these are the intentions to sort of embrace a risk-resilient future. So give a score as to whether you think our intentions are poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. And then we'll move on to the final poll. The results from this are giving a strong flavour between good, very good, and excellent. So we appreciate your views on that. The final question is a slight twist to that one, but it's saying that this updated ICZM, the policies and the actions proposed, as Richard Suko said, from a national guidance level or from a sub-area level, make you feel more confident that the future management of this sub-area will be more resilient to climate change and disasters in the future. How far do you agree with this statement? You either strongly disagree, through to neutral, agree, or strongly agree. And collectively around all the sub-areas, this will be a useful finding. And I'm pleased to say tonight that we have 55% agreeing, 9% disagreeing, but on the whole, we have a collective message that we are on the right line. So I appreciate your time on that. I'll pass over to Antonio for the final wrap up.
Good night. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you, Alison. Good evening, everybody, one more time. I really would like to thank you all for coming out tonight and joining us and giving us your questions, showing your interest and challenging us in terms of answering questions on the topics that you're interested in the coastal zone management area. Any of you who would like to, now you've heard information shared, would wish to go to the more likely document now and have a second peep, first peep, a deeper peep, and if you have any more questions that you want answered, you can please get them to us. It has been a pleasure. This particular sub area, I really enjoyed the questions and the interaction, and I hope that you all have a very good night. And before you go, please, there's an exit poll that we would like you to answer. So when we log off, do not log off immediately with us. An exit poll should come up on your browser. And please, would really like you to fill out that poll. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody. I don't know if the moderator has one last closing thing that she wants to say after my closing remarks. I'll hand back to her right now.
Thank you very much,
Alison?
Antonio. Thank you very much. Let me go over what we did tonight. We looked at the boundaries of the coastal zone management area. We looked at the hazards which affect the sub-area from Maycock's Bay to Batt's Rock. We looked at the policies and guidelines to reduce the impacts of these hazards, and we looked at the science that has been used to develop these policies in the plan. And the last thing we did, we looked at an economic analysis, quantifying the benefits of these measures. I hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion. We certainly did, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next meeting on Monday night at 6 p.m., where we will be going through their next sub-area 7, and that's from Batt's Rock to Needham's Point in St. Michael. So we look forward to seeing you. Have a good night and stay safe.